The Last Light of Ashford House. The old Buick, a loaner from a sympathetic, if somewhat bewildered cousin, coughed its final protest as it navigated the treacherous, overgrown lane. Olivia Bennet gripped the steering wheel, knuckles bone white, her gaze fixed on the skeletal silhouette that pierced the twilight gloom. Ashford House. Even from this distance, shrouded in the encroaching tendrils of bramble and ancient oak, it exuded a palpable chill, a silent, predatory watchfulness that seemed to drain the last vestiges of color from the fading sky. A thin, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, each drop feeling like a cold, insistent tap against the windshield, mirroring the rhythm of dread that had settled deep in Olivia's chest.
The air, heavy and saturated with the scent of damp earth and decay, seemed to thicken with every yard she advanced. This was not merely the smell of an abandoned place, it was the reek of something long dead, yet stubbornly refusing to crumble into dust. It was the scent of memory, curdled and sour. Ashford House had always been an anathema, a forgotten wing in the sprawling manner of her family's history, whispered about in hushed tones, never spoken of directly. Her grandmother, Evelyn, had been its last occupant, a woman whose eyes held the permanent glaze of distant horrors, whose silences were more profound than any scream.
Olivia had only vague, fragmented memories of childhood visits, a vast, echoing foyer, the oppressive weight of unseen gazes, and the persistent, unsettling feeling of being profoundly, terribly alone, even when surrounded by family. Now Evelyn was gone, swallowed by the inevitable, and Olivia, the last remaining branch of a withered lineage, was tasked with the grim duty of clearing out the remains. To extinguish the last light, as her great-aunt had morbidly put it. The car finally shuddered to a halt before a set of wrought iron gates, rusted into immobility, their intricate, forgotten designs resembling weeping vines. Beyond them, a crumbling drive, swallowed by moss and weeds, led to the house itself. It was a monolith of dark stone, its once grand facade scarred by time and neglect. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from beneath heavy, slatted brows of decaying eaves. Some were shattered, jagged teeth against the gloom, others merely coated in a thick film of grime, reflecting nothing but the gathering darkness. A single, ancient oak, its branches twisted into grotesque, supplicating forms, stood sentinel beside the front porch, its leaves a whispery chorus of lament. Olivia killed the engine, plunging the world into an immediate, profound silence, broken only by the persistent drip of rain and the frantic thrum of her own pulse. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. A shudder, involuntary and deep, racked her frame. This wasn't just a house, it was a tomb, its very stones imbued with sorrow and something far more sinister. With a heavy sigh that felt more like a surrender, she unlatched the car door. The groan of the metal was unnervingly loud in the stillness. The air outside was colder, carrying a faint metallic tang beneath the damp earth smell, like old pennies left in the rain. She retrieved a heavy, ornate key from her bag, a relic Evelyn had kept on a tarnished silver chain, as if it were a sacred artifact. It felt cold and strangely heavy in her palm. The walk to the front door was an ordeal. Each step crunched on fallen debris, a discordant symphony of decay. The porch, once an inviting space, was now a treacherous landscape of rotting wood. She pushed against the mammoth oak door, its surface rough and splintered beneath her touch. It yielded with a drawn-out, guttural shriek, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the silence, echoing into the cavernous darkness within.
The interior was a mausoleum of stale air and forgotten time. A thick blanket of dust lay over everything, a gray shroud concealing the once vibrant life of the house. The air was heavy, viscous, carrying the oppressive scent of old paper, dried flowers, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying fruit, but with an underlying sharpness, like rust or old blood. Olivia fumbled for her phone, its flashlight beam a weak, trembling beacon against the oppressive gloom. It cut through the motes of dust dancing in the stale air, illuminating colossal furniture draped in yellowed sheets, like ghostly figures trapped in eternal slumber. The foyer was vast, an echoing chamber that seemed to swallow the light. A grand staircase, its banister intricately carved with swirling serpentine patterns, ascended into absolute darkness. She moved through the house with a profound sense of intrusion, her footsteps muffled by the thick, dust-laden carpets. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the ancient structure, seemed amplified, stretched into a protracted lament. The sheer scale of the neglect was overwhelming. In the living room, a grand piano stood silent, its keys yellowed, its polished surface scarred by age. A half-knitted shawl lay draped over a rocking chair, its needles still embedded in the wool, as if Evelyn had simply risen one moment and never returned. It was a tableau of suspended life, frozen in a breath of time. It was in the drawing room, a space Olivia vaguely remembered as being filled with a perpetual twilight even in the brightest day, that the first true disquiet began to coalesce into something tangible. On the mantelpiece, above a hearth choked with cold ashes, stood 3 ornate silver candelabras. Each held a thick white candle, or what was left of one. They hadn't simply burned down, they had melted, not into wax, but into something viscous and dark, pooling in the silver dishes. It was a deep, unholy crimson, the color of clotted venous blood, congealed and glossy under the faint beam of her phone. A faint metallic tang, barely perceptible, seemed to emanate from the viscous pools. Olivia's breath hitched. This was not wax, this was something else entirely. Her fingers, trembling, instinctively recoiled from the sight. A cold dread began to seep into her bones, far deeper than the house's physical chill. She tried to rationalize it, some strange pigmented wax perhaps, but the color, the texture, the subtle stomach-churning odor, it defied any logical explanation. This was deliberate. This was malevolent. She moved on, drawn by an unseen current, deeper into the house's shadowed heart. The air grew heavier, the silence more profound, as if the very walls were holding their breath. A long, narrow gallery stretched from the main hall, lined with portraits of generations of Bennets. Their faces, stern and unsmiling, seemed to follow her as she passed. But as her flashlight beam swept across the canvas closest to her, a gasp tore from her throat. The eyes. Every single portrait, from the stern patriarchs to the prim matriarchs, even one depicting a young girl with an unnerving resemblance to her own grandmother, had their eyes violently, meticulously scratched out. Not painted over, but gouged, torn, the canvas beneath mangled into ragged holes. It was a deliberate act of defacement, an act of blind violence. The hollow socket stared back at her, not with emptiness, but with an accusatory, sightless fury. The cold dread solidified into a terrifying certainty. Someone or something had done this, and it was waiting. Olivia backed away slowly, her eyes darting from one desecrated face to the next, a silent chorus of the damned. The faces were unidentifiable now, their identities stripped, their very essence obliterated. It felt like a warning, a prelude to something unspeakable. Her phone light trembled in her hand, casting dancing, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls, mimicking the tortured expressions of the portraits. She retreated, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped within her chest. The oppressive atmosphere of the house, which had started as mere decay, now felt alive, a sentient, suffocating presence. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every creak to whisper a name. She found her way back to the foyer, the wide open space offering little comfort. The idea of spending the night here, alone, in this mausoleum of desecrated memories, was a fresh wave of terror. Yet a perverse sense of duty, or perhaps a morbid curiosity, held her captive. She couldn't leave, not without some semblance of understanding. She had to stay, she had to face it. Determined to impose some order, some illusion of normalcy, she found the kitchen, a cavernous, desolate space with rusted appliances and a sink stained with an ancient dark residue. She found a single, untouched bottle of water in her bag and forced herself to drink, the liquid feeling like ice in her parched throat. She made a meager bed on an old, dust-covered couch in a small, less intimidating study off the main hall, dragging a heavy, moth-eaten blanket over herself. The room felt marginally less hostile, perhaps because it contained shelves of forgotten books, their silent presence offering a strange academic comfort against the encroaching dread. Darkness, true and absolute, fell like a shroud over Ashford House. The rain had ceased, leaving an eerie stillness that pressed in from all sides. Olivia lay awake, her eyes wide open, staring into the impenetrable blackness. Every sound, every rustle of the wind outside, every groan of the old house settling was magnified, distorted into something sinister. She imagined the hollow eyes of the portraits watching her, the blood-like wax on the mantelpiece glistening in the unseen darkness. Just as the exhaustion threatened to drag her into a fitful slumber, a sound pierced the profound silence. It was faint at first, a delicate, tinny melody, like a child's lullaby played on an antique mechanism, a music box. Her blood ran cold. She had not seen a music box. She had not touched a music box. Yet there it was, a mournful, wistful tune emanating from somewhere deep within the house, perhaps the upper floors or a forgotten room off the main hall. The melody was innocent, yet in this context, it was a grotesque mockery, a sweet prelude to something unspeakably foul. It paused, then started again, a single looping phrase that seemed to echo the very sorrow of the house itself. It was the sound of something forgotten, something lost, yet playing on its own, a spectral performance for an unwilling audience of one. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blanket tighter around her, as if its meager fabric could shield her from the spectral song. The melody, innocent and insidious, wound its way into the silence, wrapping around her like cold, invisible tendrils, a chilling invitation to a dance with the unseen. The night had truly begun, and the house, she now knew, was far from abandoned. It was merely waiting. The music box, a delicate, tinny siren in the oppressive silence, played its looping, melancholic phrase. It was a tune that pricked at the edges of consciousness, a lullaby twisted into a dirge. Olivia lay rigid on the dust-choked couch, every muscle tensed, her eyes squeezed shut as if to physically ward off the sound. The melody, innocent and insidious, seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the darkness, tightening around her like a chokehold. It paused, a pregnant silence that felt heavier than the sound itself, then began again, a phantom echo of forgotten childhoods. She waited, suspended in a state of terror and exhaustion, for what felt like an eternity. The music box continued its spectral performance until, as abruptly as it began, it ceased. The silence that followed was not a relief, but a deeper, more profound void, as if the sound had merely carved a space for something far worse to fill. Olivia dared to open her eyes, blinking into the impenetrable blackness.
Her heart, a frantic drum against her ribs, slowly began to decelerate, leaving behind a lingering tremor in her limbs. Sleep, when it finally claimed her, was not a balm, but a trap. It was a fragmented landscape of shadowed figures at the periphery of her vision, the faint metallic tang of blood, and the recurring image of the scratched-out eyes of the portraits, their empty sockets accusing her from the gloom. She awoke with a jolt, not from a dream, but from a sensation both cold and wet, a chilling drip on her forehead. For a moment, disoriented, she thought it was the lingering drizzle from outside, seeping through a cracked roof. But the study, as far as she could tell in the pale pre-dawn light filtering weakly through the grimy window, seemed intact. Then another drop, cold and viscous, landed on her cheek, tracing a path like a tear of ice. She reached up instinctively, her fingers brushing against the liquid. It was thick, heavier than water, and possessed that same faint, metallic odor she'd noticed in the drawing room. Her hand, trembling, dropped to her lap, and she stared at the crimson smear on her fingertips. Blood. Her breath hitched, a strangled sound caught in her throat. She looked up, her gaze fixed on the ceiling directly above her. In the faint light, she could discern a darkening stain, spreading slowly, like a morbid flower blooming on the plaster. And from its center, another drop detached itself, hanging suspended for a horrifying second before falling with a soft, sickening splat onto her outstretched palm. It was undeniably blood, warm, fresh, and undeniably real. It pulsed, a dark, living entity, congealing slightly on her skin. Olivia felt a wave of nausea so potent it threatened to overwhelm her. Her stomach churned, and she scrambled off the couch, pushing herself away from the growing stain, her eyes wide with a primal terror. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, and landed hard against a bookshelf, sending a cascade of ancient leather-bound tomes tumbling to the floor. The noise, echoing in the suffocating silence, only heightened her panic. She backed into a corner, pressing herself against the cold, damp wall, her gaze glued to the ceiling. The stain grew, a monstrous Rorschach test of fear, steadily darkening, feeding on itself. This was no trick of the light, no product of an overactive imagination. This was tangible, visceral horror. The house was not merely abandoned, it was actively, malevolently alive. As the first weak rays of morning light began to pierce the gloom, Olivia's terror was replaced by a cold, desperate resolve. She needed to understand. She needed to find out what was happening. Her fear was still a living thing, gnawing at her insides, but a deeper, more profound sense of violation, a burning indignation, pushed her forward. She spent the day in a state of heightened alert, moving through the house like a ghost, her senses hyper-attuned to every creak, every whisper of the wind through the broken panes. The blood on the ceiling, she discovered, had ceased dripping, but the stain remained, a permanent scar on the plaster. She tried to clean the blood from her hands, but the faint, metallic scent seemed to cling to her, an invisible shroud. She revisited the drawing room. The candelabras still held their pools of congealed, blood-like wax, now dull and less glossy in the morning light, but no less horrifying. She stared at the scratched-out eyes of the portraits in the gallery, their desecrated faces now seeming to leer, to mock her fragile sanity. It was as if the house itself was a living organism, bleeding and watching. The music box, where was it? Driven by a morbid compulsion, she began to search, systematically, room by room. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten things, moth-eaten tapestries, ornate, dust-shrouded furniture, endless shelves of crumbling books. Each door she opened revealed another chamber frozen in time, each more desolate than the last. The scent of decay and that peculiar, sickly sweetness persisted, stronger in some rooms than others.
She found it eventually, not in an obvious place, but tucked away in a dusty, forgotten corner of her grandmother's old bedroom. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface dark with age, depicting a scene of weeping willow trees and a small, lone figure. When she touched it, a faint tremor seemed to pass through the wood as if it held a lingering charge. She tried to open it to examine its inner workings, but the clasp was rusted shut, stubbornly refusing to yield. The mere sight of it, knowing it had played by itself, sent a fresh wave of dread through her. She left it untouched, its silent presence a heavier weight in the room than any piece of furniture. As twilight once again descended upon Ashford House, bringing with it the familiar chill and the creeping shadows, Olivia found herself retreating to the relative sanctuary of the study. She lit a single candle she'd found in a kitchen drawer, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows that only seemed to deepen the gloom. She tried to read one of the ancient books, a treatise on arcane botany, but the words swam before her eyes, her mind too preoccupied with the unseen horrors lurking in the vastness of the house. She must have drifted off, lulled by the hypnotic flicker of the candle and the oppressive silence. It wasn't a deep sleep, more like a twilight state, her senses still partially alert. That's when she saw them. At first, it was just a shift in the shadows beneath the heavy mahogany desk across the room. A deeper darkness, a movement where there should be none. Her eyes, still heavy with sleep, tried to focus. Then, slowly, deliberately, a form began to emerge. It was not a solid figure, but a ripple in the darkness itself, a deeper shade of black against the already profound gloom. It flowed like spilled ink from beneath the desk, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. Long, attenuated limbs, a hunched back, and a head that seemed to melt into its shoulders. It moved with an unnatural, sinuous grace, not walking, but slithering, flowing across the dusty carpet. Then another emerged from beneath the antique chaise lounge, and another from behind the heavy velvet curtains. They were not distinct entities, but rather coalescences of shadow, their forms constantly shifting, stretching, contracting. Their movements were jerky and spasmodic, yet fluid, like insects struggling to emerge from a viscous liquid. They crept, not towards her, but across the floor, seemingly aimless, yet with a disturbing, predatory patience. There was no sound, no whisper, no rustle of fabric, only the silent, horrifying ballet of pure shadow. Olivia felt a scream catch in her throat, a raw, primal sound that refused to escape. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her body was locked in a tableau of frozen terror, her eyes wide, unblinking, fixed on the encroaching darkness. She couldn't discern any features, no eyes, no mouths, just the terrifying absence of light moving with a malevolent intent. They moved closer, not directly towards her, but surrounding the periphery of her vision, circling, always circling. The air grew colder, heavy with a palpable sense of menace. She could feel their presence, a psychic weight pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She could almost taste the fear, sharp and metallic, in her own mouth. One of them, a particularly large, amorphous mass, flowed towards the fireplace, its form expanding and contracting as it navigated the uneven hearth. It paused there, its shadowy mass seeming to absorb the faint light of the candle, making the room even darker. Then, with a chilling deliberation, it began to climb the wall, stretching and flattening itself against the surface like a grotesque spider. It reached the mantel, flowing over the candelabras with their pools of blood-like wax, then ascended further towards the ceiling.
As it neared the spot where the blood had dripped hours earlier, its form seemed to ripple, to thicken. For a fleeting moment, Olivia thought she saw something vaguely resembling a hand, a clawed appendage extending from its mass. Then it simply melted back into the shadows of the ceiling, leaving behind only the deeper darkness. The other shadowy figures continued their silent dance, weaving through the furniture, sometimes pausing, sometimes seeming to stretch and look at her, though they had no discernible eyes. The candle, which had been burning steadily, suddenly sputtered, its flame shrinking to a pinprick, threatening to extinguish completely. Olivia finally found her voice, a choked gasp that was barely audible. She shut her eyes tight, pressing her palms against them, trying to erase the terrifying vision. This was too much. The blood, the music box, the portraits, and now these impossible specters. She was not merely haunted, she was under siege. She didn't know how long she stayed there, eyes squeezed shut, trembling uncontrollably. When she finally dared to open them, the room was once again still, bathed in the faint, flickering light of the candle, which had miraculously reignited to its former strength. The shadowy figures were gone, dissolved back into the general gloom, leaving no trace save for the profound, echoing emptiness they had left behind. The exhaustion was absolute, a crushing weight that promised oblivion. She didn't know if she had screamed or if the terror had been entirely internal. All she knew was that she could not face another moment of wakefulness. She curled into a ball on the couch, pulling the blanket tight around her, praying for the release of unconsciousness, even if it brought nightmares. The next morning, the weak, gray light of dawn did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. Olivia felt heavy, sluggish, as if she had been fighting a physical battle all night. Her muscles ached, and a dull throb pulsed at the base of her skull. She pushed herself up from the couch, her body stiff and protesting. A sharp, searing pain tore through her back. It was an intense, burning sensation, as if 1,000 needles were simultaneously piercing her skin. She cried out, a guttural sound of pure agony, and instinctively reached behind her, her fingers brushing against something raised, something raw and bleeding on her skin. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She stumbled towards a tall, ornate mirror in the corner of the study, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust, reflecting a warped, ghostly image. With trembling hands, she tore at her shirt, pulling it up and over her shoulders, straining to see her own back. What she saw made the blood drain from her face, leaving her ghost white. Carved into the flesh of her lower back, a grotesque brand, were symbols. Not random scratches, but precise, intricate markings, lines and curves that seemed ancient, alien, and deeply disturbing. They were shallow but distinct, the skin around them inflamed and weeping blood, the pain a fiery agony that overshadowed all other sensations. One symbol, centrally placed, resembled a stylized, sightless eye with radiating lines like rays of malevolent light. Around it, smaller, more complex glyphs, twisted and angular, seemed to writhe. They were ritualistic, undeniable, and they had been carved into her while she slept, a silent, agonizing violation. A silent scream tore through her. This was not a haunting. This was a direct, personal assault. The house wasn't just observing her, it was claiming her. The chilling realization washed over her, cold as death itself. She was not merely a visitor to Ashford House. She was now a part of it, irrevocably marked. And the unseen entity, or entities, that dwelled within its decaying walls had just begun their terrifying work. The sight of the crude, ritualistic symbols carved into her flesh sent a wave of icy terror through Olivia, so profound that it threatened to shatter her sanity. Her reflection in the dusty mirror was a distorted mask of horror, her eyes wide, pupils dilated, staring at the weeping wounds on her back.
The pain was a living entity, burning and throbbing, each pulse a reminder of the violation. It was not just skin deep, it felt as though the very essence of her being had been branded.
She fumbled for a cloth, pressing it against the fresh cuts, a desperate attempt to staunch the blood that welled from the intricate patterns. The act was futile, the pain relentless. Her mind reeled, trying to comprehend the impossible. How? Who? The shadowy figures from the night before flashed in her mind, their silent, sinuous movements now imbued with a terrifying new context. Had they been the instruments of this defilement? The thought was more horrifying than any monster. Panic seized her, a raw, primal urge to flee, to escape the suffocating grasp of Ashford House. She stumbled out of the study, her legs shaky beneath her, her gaze darting frantically around the vast, echoing foyer.
Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every creak of the old house settling felt like a whisper of accusation. The air, already thick with decay, now seemed to press in on her, stealing her breath. She reached the front door, pushing against the heavy oak, her fingers tearing at the rusted lock. It wouldn't budge. The iron gates outside, she remembered, were also locked, impassable. She was trapped. A sob, raw and guttural, tore from her throat. The house had sealed itself around her, a tomb. Despair threatened to consume her, but beneath it, a flicker of defiance ignited. She wouldn't simply succumb. Evelyn, her grandmother, had lived here, had endured whatever malevolence festered within these walls. There had to be answers, a way to fight back.
Driven by a desperate need for understanding, Olivia began a more thorough, frantic search. She bypassed the drawing room with its blood-like wax and the gallery of gouged-out eyes. Her focus narrowed on Evelyn's private spaces. There had to be something, a diary, a hidden letter, a clue. Evelyn had been a woman of secrets, her silences deeper than any confession. Perhaps her grandmother had left behind a breadcrumb trail for this very moment. She started in Evelyn's bedroom, the same room where she had found the silent music box. The air here was particularly thick, heavy with the scent of old lavender and something else, something cloying and metallic. She systematically went through every drawer, every wardrobe, every forgotten trunk. Most contained only moth-eaten clothes, faded photographs of unsmiling ancestors, or brittle dried flowers. Then, tucked away at the bottom of a cedar chest, beneath a pile of yellowed lace, she found it. A small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with age, its pages brittle. It was not a diary, but a ledger. Its elegant script filled with cryptic entries, dates, and strange archaic symbols. Many of the symbols matched those now seared into her skin. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first few pages detailed mundane household expenses. Then the entries grew increasingly unsettling. Dates followed by single cryptic words: omen, dream, whisper, watching, and then names. A long list of names, each followed by a date, and then a single, horrifying word: taken. She flipped through the pages, her heart hammering against her ribs. The names were all Bennet's, ancestors she vaguely recognized from the portraits, and others she'd never heard of. The dates spanned centuries, each taken entry separated by decades, sometimes a full generation. Her great-aunt, who had spoken of extinguishing the last light, had been deliberately cryptic. This was the last light. She was the last. As she delved deeper, the journal began to reveal a terrifying narrative. It spoke of a pact, an ancient forbidden covenant forged by the earliest Bennets. A pact with a watcher, a blind spirit of immense power, bound to Ashford House. The entries detailed sacrifices, offerings, the appeasement of this entity, all to ensure the family's prosperity, their lineage. Each generation, it seemed, was bound to this terrible bargain, and each generation bore the mark, just as she now did. The watcher demands its due, one entry read in Evelyn's elegant hand, the ink faded but the words still chillingly clear. A life for a life, a soul for its sight. The blind must see through the eyes of the living. The final air, the last light, must complete the cycle. Olivia's blood ran cold. The final air, the last light. Evelyn hadn't extinguished the light. She had merely passed on the torch. And Olivia, unknowingly, had stepped into the flame. She was the final sacrifice. The ritual symbols on her back were not merely a mark. They were an invitation, a summoning. The journal described the watcher not as a ghost, but as something far older, primordial, a hungry void that resided in the deepest shadows of the house. It was blind, but it perceived through the spiritual echoes of the living, through their fear, their pain, and it demanded eyes, living eyes. As she read, the air in the room grew heavy, cold, and still. The scent of cloying sweetness intensified, now undeniably mixed with something else, the sharp, metallic tang of blood, stronger than ever before. It wasn't just the room, it was the air she breathed, infiltrating her lungs, tasting of dread. A low, guttural moan seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house, a deep, resonant vibration that made the floorboards tremble beneath her feet. It was a sound of profound hunger, an ancient, patient waiting. Olivia clutched the journal to her chest, her heart a frantic drum against the brittle pages. The truth in all its brutal horror had revealed itself. Her ancestors had condemned her, tied her to this ancient, monstrous pact. She was a lamb led to slaughter, her fate sealed before she was even born. The moan grew louder, closer, an oppressive, all-encompassing sound. The room grew darker, the faint light from the window seeming to recede, swallowed by an encroaching gloom. The temperature plummeted, and Olivia could see her own breath pluming in the air. Suddenly, a violent shudder ripped through the house. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a brittle, tearing sound echoed from the walls, as if the very foundations were groaning under an immense, unseen pressure. The music box, still sitting untouched on the dresser, began to play. Not the gentle, looping lullaby from before, but a frantic, discordant jingle, notes clashing against each other in a grotesque cacophony. Then, from the corners of the room, from beneath the bed, from behind the heavy wardrobe, they emerged again, the shadowy figures. But this time, they were different. More defined, more numerous, their forms larger, more aggressive. They flowed from the darkness with a chilling speed, their amorphous shapes coalescing into vague skeletal limbs, claw-like appendages that seemed to stretch and retract with a life of their own. They didn't just crawl, they surged, like a dark tide, filling the room, pressing in on her from all sides. Their silent movements were punctuated by an almost imperceptible rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across a desolate landscape. The air grew thick with a palpable malevolence, a sense of crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. One of the figures, larger than the rest, flowed directly towards her, its form a roiling mass of pure shadow. As it drew closer, Olivia thought she could discern a deeper void within its center, a swirling vortex of nothingness that seemed to pull at her very soul. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, a chilling vacuum that stole all warmth, all light. She stumbled backward, tripping over a forgotten rug, and landed hard against the wall. The pain in her back flared, a white-hot agony that mingled with her terror. She pressed herself against the cold plaster, clutching the journal, her eyes wide with unadulterated fear. The shadowy figures swarmed around her, not touching, but enveloping her in their chilling presence. She could feel their coldness, their hunger, pressing in, threatening to consume her. They writhed, their forms shifting, creating a dizzying, disorienting dance of darkness. The music box continued its frantic, despondent jingle, a grotesque soundtrack to her impending doom. Then, from the depths of the swirling darkness, a voice. Not a sound, but a presence, a thought projected directly into her mind, cold and ancient, devoid of inflection, yet resonating with an immense, terrifying power. She is marked. The final offering. The eyes will see. The blind will know. The words were not her own, yet they echoed in her mind, a violation more profound than the carvings on her back. It was the voice of the Watcher, the ancient spirit, confirming her horrifying fate. As the voice faded, the shadowy figures began to coalesce, to merge into a single massive form directly in front of her. The process was agonizingly slow, each ripple of darkness building upon the last, growing taller, denser, more defined. The music box reached a crescendo of frantic, clashing notes, then abruptly stopped, plunging the room into a chilling silence. The combined mass of shadow loomed over her, a towering monolith of pure darkness. And then, slowly, agonizingly, it began to tear itself apart, not dispersing, but revealing. The outer layers of shadow peeled back like old skin, revealing something far more horrifying beneath. It was not solid, not fully corporeal, but a shifting, grotesque form, a nightmare made manifest. Torn flesh, not human, but something ancient and withered, hung in strips from what looked like a skeletal frame. What little remained of its skin was slick, glistening with something dark and viscous, like old blood, constantly seeping, refreshing itself. There were no discernible features, no face, no eyes, just a cavernous void where a head should be, a gaping maw of perpetual darkness. Its limbs were elongated, disproportionate, ending in sharpened claw-like appendages that dripped with the same dark fluid. It stood, hunched and immense, a silent, grotesque figure of pure suffering and malevolence. Its presence was a physical assault, a crushing weight of despair and hunger. Olivia couldn't scream. She couldn't breathe. Her heart felt as if it had stopped entirely. This was the Watcher, the blind spirit, revealed in its raw, terrifying form, a manifestation of ancient horror. It was more gruesome, more visceral than anything her nightmares could have conceived. It raised one of its impossibly long, clawed arms, pointing a dripping digit directly at her. No, not at her, but at her face, specifically at her eyes. And then another voice, distinct from the first, a dry, raspy whisper, filled the room, seeming to emanate from the void where its face should be. "The time has come, little bird. The offering is ready. You will see for me. You will know for me. The last light will burn for me." The words were a death knell. Olivia felt her consciousness beginning to fray at the edges, the sheer horror threatening to drag her down into an abyss of madness. The monstrous form of the Watcher, dripping and grotesque, loomed over her, its unseen gaze fixed on her. The journal, still clutched in her hand, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She knew now. She understood the full, terrifying scope of her inheritance. But understanding brought no comfort, only the chilling certainty of her impending doom. The Watcher had revealed itself, and it was hungry. Part 4.
The Watcher loomed, a grotesque monument to suffering and primordial hunger, its form a shifting tapestry of torn flesh and oozing darkness. The air in Evelyn's bedroom thickened to a suffocating density, heavy with the reek of ancient blood and something else, a cold, metallic tang that seemed to scrape against the inside of Olivia's throat. Its raspy voice, a dry whisper that felt like a violation of her very thoughts, echoed in the sudden, profound silence, sealing her fate. "The last light will burn for me." Olivia's body was frozen, a statue of pure terror. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the monstrosity before her, on the gaping void where a head should be, on the dripping, clawed appendage that pointed directly at her face. Her eyes, the words from the journal screamed in her mind. A life for a life, a soul for its sight. The blind must see through the eyes of the living. She was the final offering, destined to be consumed, her very essence a vessel for an ancient, insatiable hunger. The Watcher's presence was a physical assault, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs. She felt a profound coldness emanating from it, a chill that penetrated bone and marrow, leaving her trembling uncontrollably. The pain from the ritualistic carvings on her back flared, a burning agony that mingled with the absolute terror. It was as if her body itself was reacting to the presence of its tormentor, a beacon for its malevolence. Then, with an agonizing slowness, the Watcher began to move. It didn't walk, it seemed to flow, its grotesque form rippling and stretching, gliding across the floor towards her. Each shift of its torn flesh, each drip of the viscous fluid from its limbs was a horror in itself. The shadowy figures, which had initially surrounded her, seemed to melt back into the general gloom, dissolving into the deeper darkness of the room, as if their purpose had been served, their master now fully manifest. As the Watcher drew closer, a strange, high-pitched ringing began in Olivia's ears, intensifying with each agonizing inch the creature advanced. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate directly inside her skull, threatening to split it open. Her vision blurred at the edges, the room spinning, the monstrosity before her dissolving into a kaleidoscope of terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, a desperate, futile attempt to unsee the horror, to deny its existence. But the ringing intensified, and the cold, ancient voice echoed again in her mind, not a whisper this time, but a resonant hum. "Open your eyes, little bird, witness your purpose, witness your end." Against her will, her eyelids fluttered open. The Watcher was impossibly close now, its dripping form towering over her, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow all light. She could feel its breath, a cold, stale gust that smelled of dust, decay, and something else. Something ancient and inorganic, like stagnant water from a forgotten crypt. Suddenly, a searing pain shot through her left eye, a sharp, piercing agony that made her gasp, a strangled sound of pure torture. She clawed at her face, but her hands were trapped, pinned against the wall by an unseen force. She could feel something pressing against her eyelid, something cold and sharp, meticulously, agonizingly tearing. The world exploded into a symphony of pain. A blinding white light consumed her vision, accompanied by an excruciating pressure, as if her very eyeball was being slowly, deliberately gouged from its socket. The ringing in her ears became an unbearable shriek, and she felt a hot, viscous fluid begin to stream down her cheek, mingling with her tears. She screamed then, a raw, animalistic sound ripped from the depths of her soul, a sound of pure agony and violation.
It was a scream that tore through the silence of Ashford House, echoing in the vast, empty halls, a testament to her suffering. The pain was beyond anything she had ever known, a torment that threatened to obliterate her consciousness. She felt herself teetering on the edge of a precipice, sanity slipping away like sand through her fingers. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white light and agonizing sensation. Then, as abruptly as it began, the searing pain in her eye subsided, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. The ringing in her ears sated, leaving behind an eerie silence. The pressure on her hands released. She stumbled forward, collapsing to her knees, clutching at her face, her fingers coming away slick with blood and something else, a viscous, jelly-like substance that made her stomach heave. She dared to open her right eye, the left one now a blinding, throbbing void. The room was no longer completely dark. A faint greenish luminescence now emanated from the watcher, its grotesque form shimmering with an otherworldly glow. It no longer towered over her. It had receded slightly, its immense presence still dominating the room, but no longer directly invading her personal space. But the most horrifying change was not in the watcher, but in herself. As she knelt there, panting, clutching her defiled face, a strange sensation began to bloom in her remaining eye. It was not pain, but a sudden, overwhelming influx of information, a flood of images, sensations, and emotions that were not her own. She saw, not with her own eye, but with the perspective of something ancient, something hungry. She saw the house, not as stone and wood, but as a living, breathing entity, its foundations pulsing with a dark energy. She saw the layers of time, the echoes of past inhabitants, their joys, their sorrows, their terrors, all swirling around her like spectral currents. She saw the generations of Bennets, their lives unfolding in rapid, disorienting flashes, births, deaths, whispered pacts, desperate appeasements. And she saw the Watcher not as a grotesque monster, but as a vast, ancient hunger, a blind, insatiable entity bound to this place, to this family. It perceived through fear, through pain, through the spiritual traces left behind, and now it perceived through her. The world through this new horrifying vision was not merely visual, it was a sensory overload. She tasted the fear of her ancestors, felt their desperate hope, heard the silent screams of those taken. The ritual symbols on her back now burned with a cold, internal fire, connecting her, binding her to this terrifying new perception. She looked at her own hands, still smeared with blood, and saw them as if through the Watcher's eyes, a conduit, a tool, a new appendage. The thought was chilling, a violation of her very self. She was still Olivia, yet she was no longer entirely Olivia. A part of her had been torn away, and another, alien consciousness had filled the void. The Watcher's form, shimmering with that eerie green light, seemed to solidify slightly, to gain a new, terrible clarity through her perception. Its torn flesh, its oozing darkness, now felt less like a monster and more like a manifestation of pure, unadulterated suffering. It was a mirror, reflecting the torment it inflicted and the torment it had itself endured through millennia of blind hunger. A new whisper, clearer now, less internal, seemed to emanate from the Watcher directly into her soul. Through you, I remember. Through you, I perceive. Through you, I am whole. The words were not triumphant, but filled with a profound, ancient loneliness, a bottomless pit of longing that was almost more terrifying than its hunger. It wasn't just physical sight it craved, it was connection, memory, the vivid, sensory experience of existence denied to it for eons.
Olivia felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of pity, quickly overshadowed by a fresh wave of horror. This creature, this ancient abomination, was using her, consuming her, not just for her eyes, but for her very perception, her consciousness. She was becoming its eyes, its ears, its conduit to a world it could only dimly grasp. She tried to fight it, to push back against the influx of alien sensations, to reclaim her own mind. But it was like trying to stem a tidal wave with her bare hands. The Watcher's presence, its hunger, was overwhelming, consuming. Her gaze, now augmented by this terrible, unwanted perception, drifted to the window. It was still pre-dawn, the sky a bruised purple, promising a gray, desolate day. But through her new sight, she saw beyond the physical pain. She saw the spiritual energies of the land, the ley lines crisscrossing the earth, all converging on Ashford House, feeding it, sustaining it, and ultimately sustaining the Watcher. The house was not just a container, it was an anchor, a power source. The full, terrifying scope of the pact settled over her like a shroud. This was not a quick death. This was a slow, agonizing assimilation, a merging of souls, where her consciousness would be subsumed, her identity gradually eroded, until only the Watcher remained, seeing through her eyes, living through her senses, forever trapped within the decaying walls of Ashford House. She would become a part of its eternal blindness, its endless hunger. She felt a new pain, not physical, but existential. The loss of self, the impending erasure of Olivia Bennet. It was a horror far greater than any physical mutilation. The Watcher's raspy voice, now almost a mournful sigh, echoed in her mind one last time. "We are one now, little bird. The last light has joined the endless darkness. The cycle is complete." As the words resonated, the green luminescence around the Watcher intensified, flaring brightly, illuminating the torn flesh, the oozing darkness of its form with an unholy radiance. The house itself seemed to pulse with this light, a living, breathing entity, its ancient stones absorbing the terrible energy. Olivia felt a final, agonizing pull, a sensation of being stretched, drawn, her essence dissolving into the vast, consuming presence of the Watcher. Her vision, through her one remaining eye, grew sharper, clearer, yet less her own. She was looking out, but it was no longer Olivia Bennet truly seeing. It was the Watcher, finally perceiving the world with the clarity it had craved for centuries. The last flicker of her own consciousness, a desperate, dying ember, clung to a single, terrifying thought. She was gone. Not dead, but something far worse. She was merely a lens, a conduit, a prisoner within her own flesh, forced to witness the world through the endless, insatiable hunger of a blind, ancient entity. Ashford House had claimed her, and the last light, her own soul, had been extinguished. But her story, as a conscious entity, was not quite over. Not yet. The world, as Olivia now perceived it, was a cacophony of spectral echoes and raw, unadulterated hunger. Her left eye, torn from its socket, was a throbbing void, but her right eye, her only remaining window to the physical, saw with a terrible alien clarity. It was not her sight alone, but the ancient cumulative vision of the Watcher, sifting through layers of time and spiritual residue, seeking its endless sustenance. She was a mere lens, a conduit, her consciousness a dying ember, struggling against the consuming inferno of another's will. The Watcher, its grotesque form still shimmering with that unholy green luminescence, pulsed with a renewed vitality. Its ripped flesh seemed to knit, albeit into something still inhuman and terrifying, but imbued with a strange, dark energy.
The viscous fluid that had dripped from its limbs now seemed to flow into its form, nourishing it, solidifying its monstrous presence. It no longer merely existed, it thrived, drawing strength from her, from the completion of the pact. Olivia's own body was no longer entirely hers. The ritual symbols carved into her back burned with a cold internal fire, pulsing in rhythm with the Watcher's perceived hunger. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, yet imbued with an unnatural strength when the Watcher willed it. She was an unwilling puppet, her mind a besieged fortress, its walls crumbling under the relentless assault of an ancient consciousness. A new whisper, clearer, stronger than before, echoed directly in her soul. The long night ends, the darkness sees, and the house remembers. Through her, the Watcher began to move, not with the sinuous flow of shadow, but with a deliberate, heavy tread. Each step was a jarring jolt through Olivia's own body, a sensation of ancient power reawakening. It moved out of Evelyn's bedroom, through the long, silent gallery where the defaced portraits now seemed to stare with a palpable, unseen malice. Their scratched-out eyes burning with the Watcher's own terrifying perception. Through her, the Watcher saw the blood-like wax on the mantelpiece in the drawing room, not as a horrifying curiosity, but as an offering accepted, a silent testament to the efficacy of the pact. It saw the dust-shrouded furniture, the decaying tapestries, the very stones of Ashford House, not as inanimate objects, but as extensions of itself, vessels holding centuries of its lonely, blind vigil. Olivia's last vestiges of individuality fought back, a desperate internal scream against the rising tide of assimilation. She tried to reclaim her own thoughts, to focus on a memory, her mother's face, the warmth of sunlight, anything that was hers. But the Watcher's presence was too vast, too ancient, too absolute. Her memories were like fading photographs, dissolving into the swirling vortex of the entity's own primordial experience. She was drowning, not in water, but in centuries of another's existence. The physical world began to react to the Watcher's renewed power. The very foundations of Ashford House groaned, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, up through Olivia's feet, into her bones. Dust rained from the ceilings in thick cascades. Windows already cracked, suddenly spiderwebbed with new fissures, some shattering inward with sharp, violent sounds, but the glass fragments merely dissolved into motes of dust before they hit the ground. The house was not just shaking, it was transforming, becoming more alive, more sentient, a physical manifestation of the Watcher's awakened hunger. The wind, which had been still, now howled through the newly broken panes, a mournful lament that seemed to carry the voices of the taken, the generations of Bennets who had fallen victim to the pact. Olivia, as the Watcher, perceived them not as individual spirits, but as echoes, energy residues that were now being drawn into its core, feeding its insatiable hunger, becoming part of its eternal consciousness. The Watcher, through Olivia, walked down the grand staircase, its intricate, serpentine banister feeling cold and alive beneath her hand. It moved with a sense of purpose towards the deepest, darkest heart of Ashford House, the cellars, the buried secrets beneath the very foundations. As they descended into the oppressive darkness of the cellar, the air grew colder, heavier, saturated with the ancient scent of damp earth, mildew, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness that was now overwhelmingly potent, almost sickeningly so. It was the smell of long dormant power, of forbidden rituals and countless sacrifices. Here, in the deepest recesses of the house, the Watcher's presence pulsed with an overwhelming intensity. The green luminescence around its form flared, casting dancing shadows that writhed on the rough-hewn stone walls. Olivia's remaining eye, now fully a conduit, saw arcane symbols etched into the very rock, glowing faintly with an internal light.
These were the true binding runes, the ancient script of the pact, centuries old, drawing power from the earth itself. In the center of the cellar, beneath a crumbling archway, stood a crude stone altar, stained dark with age and countless rituals. Upon it, a single, decaying human skull rested, its eye sockets hollow, filled with an inky blackness. It was not a memento mori, it was a focal point, a symbol of the generations of sight stolen, of lives consumed. The watcher, through Olivia, approached the altar. The chanting began then, not from the watcher, but from within Olivia's own mind, an ancient guttural language, a resonance of primordial power. It was the language of the pact, the words of binding and sacrifice, flowing from her own lips, yet not by her own will. Her mouth moved, forming the horrific sounds, her voice echoing in the cavernous cellar, resonating with the very stones. As the chanting reached a crescendo, the earth beneath them trembled violently. The arcane symbols on the walls flared with blinding light, pulses of raw energy surging through the cellar. The decaying skull on the altar began to vibrate, a low hum emanating from its hollow depths, growing louder, more insistent. Olivia felt her consciousness, that last dying ember, flicker wildly, threatened by the overwhelming influx of power. She was dissolving, fading, her essence being integrated into the watcher, into the very house. She was no longer Olivia Bennet observing, she was becoming Ashford House, experiencing its ancient, hungry core. The watcher raised its impossibly long, dripping claw towards the skull. As it did, Olivia felt a final, agonizing pull, a sensation of her very soul being stretched, torn, and then reconfigured. Her personal memories, her individual identity were not merely erased, they were absorbed, twisted, becoming part of the watcher's vast, unholy repository. She was not gone, not truly. She was simply expanded, scattered, bound. The claw touched the skull. A blinding flash of green light erupted from the altar, consuming the cellar, swallowing all shadows, all form, all sound. Olivia's consciousness fractured, splintering into countless fragments, each one an echo of her former self, yet each now inextricably linked to the watcher, to the house, to the ancient pact. When the light faded, the cellar was plunged into an even deeper, more profound darkness. The green luminescence around the watcher was gone. The grotesque form of torn flesh and oozing darkness was gone. The chanting had ceased. The skull on the altar remained, but now, from its hollow eye sockets, a faint emerald glow pulsed, and Olivia Bennet, as an individual, was gone. But she was not extinguished, not entirely. Her fractured consciousness was now omnipresent within Ashford House. She was the creaking of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind through broken panes, the chilling draft that swept through the vast, empty rooms. She saw through the dust-coated windows, felt the decay in the rotting wood, tasted the metallic tang of blood in the very air. She was the echoing silence, the oppressive gloom, the ancient hunger that pulsed from the very foundations. She was the house, and the house was the watcher. The last light in Ashford House, her last spark of independent humanity, had indeed extinguished forever. But it was not a sudden death, it was a terrifying, eternal assimilation. Night fell again over Ashford House, a darkness deeper than any before. No lights flickered in its vacant windows, no more music boxes played. Only the profound, sentient stillness of an ancient entity finally made whole. Through her, as the house, Olivia felt the approach of new footsteps on the overgrown lane. A curious hiker, perhaps, a lost motorist, or another unsuspecting soul, drawn by the irresistible pull of the ancient stones. And through her, as the watcher, she felt the familiar stirrings of hunger, ancient and insatiable, awakening within the depths of Ashford House. The last light was gone. But the blind now saw, and it was waiting, always waiting, for the next light to burn. But the blind now saw, and it was waiting, always waiting, for the next light to burn.